Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Lost in Math. I'm Mr. Wheeler. Today we're learning how to solve quadratic equations by a method called completing the square. If you remember, we have 5 ways to solve quadratic equations. We learned how to solve them by graphing and factoring and square roots, and today we're learning how to solve by completing the square. Then there's another one we'll get to later. So completing the square, it's kind of like factoring and square root method combined in a one big amazing thing. So if you remember, when we were solving square roots, card in the top right hand corner if you don't remember, when we were solving square roots, in order to do it, we needed to get x squared by itself equaling a number. X squared equals something. Today's lesson's kind of similar, except instead of x squared, we want to get a binomial squared equaling a number. For instance, x plus 3 squared, that would be something we would want to get by itself. X plus 3 squared, when we square it, it's what's called a perfect square trinomial. X plus 3 squared is x plus 3 times x plus 3. Multiply, we get x squared plus 6x plus 9. X squared plus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial, and it'll be very important for us today. So we'll be finding perfect square trinomials, factoring them, using square roots, and then getting answers. But we're going to take that one step at a time. So for starters, let's pretend we already have a perfect square trinomial in its factored form, and it equals a number. So let's say we have x plus 2 squared equals 9. We want to solve for x. To do that, it's very similar to a square root problem. We have to take the square root of both sides to get rid of that squared. So the square root of x plus 2 squared is just x plus 2, and that equals the square root of 9. Remember, when we take the square root of a number, we get a positive root and a negative root. So x plus 2 equals 3 or negative 3. So I got 2 problems to solve, either x plus 2 equals 3 or x plus 2 equals negative 3. So it's 2 one-step equations. Solve. So x equals 1 or x equals negative 5. So that's how we do it once we have a perfect square trinomial factored equaling a number. So our first thing we're going to learn is how to get a perfect square trinomial. We won't always have perfect square trinomials, but we need them in order to do the completing the square method. So we have to find a way to get a perfect square trinomial. So let's look at how to do that. So if we have a problem, x squared plus bx, in order to turn that into a perfect square trinomial, complete the square, we take our b, divide it by 2, and square it. So if we want to turn that into a perfect square trinomial, we'll take b, divide it by 2, and square it, and add it to the end. So for example, if I had x squared plus 6x, in order to turn that into a perfect square trinomial, we would take our b, which is a positive 6, divide it by 2, which is 3, and then square it, which is 9. So that's what I would add. So x squared plus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial. If you factored it, it would turn into x plus 3 times x plus 3, or x plus 3 squared. So it is a perfect square trinomial. So generally speaking, to make something a perfect square trinomial, b divided by 2 squared. B divided by 2 squared. That's what you add to your problem. So we have some example problems on our notes. So look at all those and find out what you would add to each problem in order to turn it into a perfect square trinomial. So you're looking for b divided by 2 squared. On A, x squared plus 10x plus what would make it a perfect square trinomial? B is equal to 10. So we take 10, divide it by 2, and square it. So 25 would be what I add. X squared plus 10x plus 25 is a perfect square trinomial. To check it, and for practice, because we'll be factoring later, if I factored that, it would factor into x plus 5 times x plus 5, so x plus 5 squared. So it was a perfect square trinomial. If you notice that 5 was our b divided by 2 before we squared it. 10 divided by 2 was 5, and then we squared it to make it 25. That number that we get added to, so x plus what squared, that number will always be equal to b divided by 2. So that might be helpful later. On b, x squared minus 9x plus what would make it a perfect square trinomial? B is negative 9. So b divided by 2, negative 9 over 2 squared. You could make it a decimal. I'm just going to leave it as an improper fraction. So negative 9 halves squared would be negative 9 halves times negative 9 halves. So I get positive 81 fourths. So that's what I would add to my problem. So it would be x squared minus 9x plus 81 fourths. If I was factoring it, it would turn into x minus 9 over 2 times x minus 9 over 2. So x minus 9 halves squared. Remember what I tried to explain in the last example. The thing getting added or subtracted is always whatever b divided by 2 was. So negative 9 divided by 2 was negative 9 halves. So it turned into x minus 9 halves squared. On C, x squared plus 12x plus what? B is 12 divided by 2, square it. So it would be x squared plus 12x plus 36 would be my perfect square trinomial. If I factored it, it would turn in x plus 6 squared. So perfect square trinomials, b divided by 2 squared, add it, then we're good. So now we've learned all the pieces to how to solve a problem by completing the square, hopefully. We'll break it up in a bunch of steps. Step 1, be sure it's written in the form x squared plus bx equals c. X squared plus bx equals c. Notice all your x terms are on the left-hand side of your equal sign. All your numbers are on the right-hand side. And there's nothing multiplying your x squared. If there's something multiplying your x squared, you have to get rid of it. Before we get started doing these problems, they have to be written x squared plus bx equals c. Step 1. Step 2, we want to complete the square. So we want to make our left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. We want to make x squared plus bx a perfect square trinomial. So we complete the square by finding b over 2 squared and adding it. If we do something on one side of the equation, we have to do it to the other. So you find b over 2 squared, add it to both sides of your equation. After that, step 3, you factor. So we will factor our perfect square trinomial. And then step 4, we'll solve the problem by square roots. And step 5, write down our answer. So those steps hopefully will make more sense in practice. So let's try an example problem. So our example problem, x squared plus 14x equals 15. Step 1, we want to make sure it's written in the form x squared plus bx equals c. And it is. All of my x terms are on the left-hand side of my equal sign. There's nothing multiplying my x squared. So step 1, check. Step 2, we want to make the left-hand side a perfect square trinomial. So we got to find b divided by 2 squared and add it to both sides of my equation. So b is 14. So we take 14 divided by 2, 7. And 7 squared is 49. So I add 49. So the left-hand side of the problem turns into x squared plus 14x plus 49. Perfect square trinomial. In an equation, they got to remain balanced. So anything you do to one side, you have to also do to the other. So on the right-hand side, 15 plus 49 is 64. So we get x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals 64. Next, step 3, we factor. So we factor the left-hand side. It's a perfect square trinomial, so hopefully it'll factor into something times itself. And when we factor it, it factors in x plus 7 times x plus 7. 7 times 7 is 49. 7 plus 7, 14. Check. So I'll write this as x plus 7 squared equals 64. Next, step 4. We solve the problem using square roots. So I have a number squared equaling another number. X plus 7 squared equals 64. So to solve it, we take the square root of both sides. So square root of x plus 7 squared is just x plus 7. And the square root of 64 is 8 or negative 8. So I have two one-step equations to solve. X plus 7 equals 8 or x plus 7 equals negative 8. So I solve those really fast. So x equals 1 or x equals negative 15. So those would be my two answers. I could check them by plugging them into my original problem, being sure it worked. I'll let someone else do that. And it worked. So if that made sense, why don't you try the next 3 examples on your own, and then we'll see how it went. If it didn't make sense, you can still try. All right, good luck. On B, x squared minus 2x minus 2 equals 0. Step 1, it is not written the right way. We want it x squared plus bx equals c. So in order to make our problem look the way we want, we have to get rid of that minus 2. To get rid of subtraction, we use addition. So we add 2 to both sides. So now my problem is x squared minus 2x equals 2, which is better what we want. Step 1 done. Step 2, we want to make a perfect square trinomial. So I take my b, negative 2, divide it by 2 and square it. So negative 2 divided by 2 squared is positive 1. So I add 1 to both sides. So I get x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 3. Next, we factor. When I factor my perfect square trinomial, I get x minus 1 squared. So x minus 1 squared equals 3. And I'm ready for step 4, solving by square roots. So I take the square root of both sides. So x minus 1 equals the square root of 3, or x minus 1 equals the negative square root of 3. So when I solve those one-step equations, add 1 to both sides. So x equals 1 plus the square root of 3, or x equals 1 minus the square root of 3. That's as good an answer as we're going to get without awful decimals. So x equals 1 plus the square root of 3, or 1 minus the square root of 3. On C, x squared plus 10x equals negative 9. Step 1, check. It's written the right way. X values on the left, numbers on the right. Nothing multiplying x squared, so we're good on step 1. Step 2, I want to turn it into a perfect square trinomial. So I take my b, 10, divided by 2 and square it. And I get 25, so I want to add 25 to both sides of my equal sign. So my problem turns into x squared plus 10x plus 25 equals 16. Next, we factor. When I factor my perfect square trinomial, I get x plus 5 squared. So my problem turns into x plus 5 squared equals 16. And now I solve by square roots. So I square root both sides. So x plus 5 equals 4, or x plus 5 equals negative 4. Solve a couple one-step equations. So x equals negative 1, or x equals negative 9. On D, 2x squared plus 12x plus 20 equals 0. Step 1, it is not written the right way. First, I'll move that plus 20 over because it has to equal the numbers, only x's on the left-hand side. So I get 2x squared plus 12x equals negative 20. Next, I have a number multiplying x squared. It's 2x squared. I want it to just be x squared. To get rid of multiplication, we use division. We have to do it to the entire left-hand side and the entire right-hand side. So everything gets divided by 2. So my problem turns into x squared plus 6x equals negative 10. Now it's written in the right way. Step 1, complete. Step 2, I want to complete the square. So on my left-hand side, 6 divided by 2 squared would be 9. So I add 9 to both sides. So I get x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals negative 1. Next I factor. So that factors in x plus 3 squared equals negative 1. Next I take the square root of both sides, and I get a problem. I cannot take the square root of negative 1. You can't take the square root of negative numbers. So I can just stop right here, and x is no real solutions. There are no real solutions to this problem because I cannot take the square root of a real number. So that wraps up our notes on completing the square. Be sure it's written in the right form for this method. X squared plus bx equals c. Make perfect square trinomials, factor, solve, and that's all. So take your time, be careful with your work, and be sure and like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe so you're not missing a thing, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye, guys. So this will be like, all right. Why would I push on pause and then scratch my head? Okay. So I got x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals 64. Dang it. Why did I pause? On B, plus 10x plus 25 equals 16. Okay, so check. Step 2, we want to